All right, tonight we're in to chapter 10 of 2 Samuel, and I will let you know now one verse that you're going to get into, and we'll speak about it a little bit, but that's going to be our theme for Sunday as well, verse 12 that we'll be looking at a little bit later, because it is an encouragement. But a couple different titles I could have come up with this, and I just ended up settling with David and the Ammonites. It's going to go a little bit further than that, even into chapter 11, but I thought this is one of those where you could probably benefit from a little history about the Ammonites. And the children of Ammon really had only a small mention in the battles with David prior to this major conflict. And so we read it before with all the other battles that he had done, but they're really included only by name without any details of the battle, and that happened in chapter 8. They're mentioned just simply as one of the nations that David subdued along with the Syrians, which they are very close together with, and others from whom, again, David took the spoils of silver and gold. But now you're going to find out they're really tied in closely, not only with the Syrians, but also with the Moabites. In fact, that's very notable. The Ammonites, you'll find out, were descendants of Lot. They are descendants of Lot and his youngest daughter. If you remember, they, along with the Moabites, were product of the incest between Lot and his daughters when they made their father drunk and slept with him, and both became pregnant. And they created these two other nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites, who were nothing but thorns in the flesh of Israel. But to take particular note of them too, God told Moses not to meddle with them or cause them distress. In Deuteronomy, when we start looking at their history, Deuteronomy 2 and 19 is, God said, "When thou comest nigh over against the children of Ammon, distress them not, nor meddle with them, for I will not give thee of the land of the children of Ammon any possession, because I have given it unto the children of Lot for a possession." A little history there. Both of these nations, though, were also cursed by God. In fact, by law, the Ammonites were not allowed to enter into, both of them were not allowed to enter into the congregation of Israel or even to marry an Israelite woman. No personal or business transaction or interaction was to be taken care of with them. In Deuteronomy 23, in verse 3, it says, "An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord." Most will say this was an exclusion that was permanent, because to the 10th generation, by that time they won't even know who's a Moabite and who's an Ammonite. But you'll also read why, verse 4, "Because they met you not with bread and water in the way when you came forth out of Egypt, and," here's the other kicker, "because they hired against thee Balaam, the son of Beor, of Pethor, of Mesopotamia, to curse thee." If you remember, that's what they were trying to do, was to get Israel cursed. Couldn't do it. Balaam couldn't do it. But he did tell them how to ruin them was by causing them to marry. But they were told not to, but ended up. Now we also know, after we read a little bit more, that they were idolaters. They were also a very cruel people. We met them first in 1 Samuel, just after Saul was made king. And they had come, if you remember, after the city and the men of Jabesh Gilead, and they said, we're going to offer you a life of servitude if you'll put out your right eye. And of course they said, well, let us think about it. They sent a message, and Saul gathered over 300,000 men and defeated the Ammonites. But then we find out later too, in Amos, here's where again we find something more. So I say they were very cruel, and God's curse came upon them because of this brutality of targeting and literally killing pregnant women. They were seeking to enlarge their boundaries. And so we see in Amos 1 and 13, thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of the children of Ammon, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have ripped up the women with child of Gilead, that they might enlarge their border. They were ripping the children right out of the womb. They were destroying both. They wanted to make sure that the children of Israel could not produce more children and cause them a problem in the future. They are an idolatrous, wicked, depraved people who, though sadly we find them entering into the life of Israel, how? Through King Solomon and through his many wives. In the parallel passage of this same story, you can find it in 1 Chronicles 19. But part of their problem was, again, or I should say Solomon's problem, when he tried to create alliances. And he married some of these women, but these women, he would end up building them a house to their God. And that was where the Ammonites got a foothold more during his particular time. Now, I started to entitle this really David's kindness to the Ammonites, but of course, that's being misnomer because it only happens in the first couple of verses. So we'll look at that first as far as David's kindness, and specifically to Hanun. In 2 Samuel 10 and verse 1, now we'll actually get into the chapter. It came to pass after this that the king of the children of Ammon died, and Hanun his son reigned in his stead. Then David said, I will show kindness unto Hanun the son of Nahash, as his father showed kindness unto me. And David sent to comfort him by the hand of his servants for his father. And David's servants came into the land of the children of Ammon. Now, a lot of people will speculate of what this kindness was that David showed. Now, we know that David showed kindness, there was kindness showed to him by the Moabites when he inserted his family there with the Moabites and asked for protection for them. So a lot of people will tie this into it because the Moabites and the Ammonites were together. But this isn't necessarily the case. It could have been that David, again, while he was in exile, that the Ammonites showed him some sort of kindness. What it was that how they showed him kindness, we don't know. It does not say, other than, again, where David was shown kindness to the Moabites for allowing his parents to stay there. But it didn't matter because that kindness was rejected. In verse 3, and the princes of the children of Ammon said unto Hanun, their lord, thinkest thou that David doth honor thy father, that he hath sent comforters unto thee? In other words, no way. They came up with their conspiracy theories, as there always are conspirators and conspiracy theorists. Hath not David rather sent his servants unto thee to search the city and to spy it out and to overthrow it? Well, again, this is one of those, I think, and I would agree here with A.W. Pink when he's writing us this, that it's an unsound move to make friends of those who are your natural enemies. And they have been, and they always will be. He compares this, though, to making friends with the world. And I would guarantee you that's not a good idea either. Making friends with the world is never a good idea. In the end, the children of Ammon were a problem to Israel, and they needed to simply be wiped out. For us, understanding with the friends, making friends with the world, making friends with our flesh, trying to make a covenant with our flesh, trying to appease the flesh. Listen, don't covenant with your flesh, crucify the flesh. That's what's most important. Now the counselors saw David as plotting to overthrow them, and Hanun believed them, and so he took an action that would end up resulting in something deadly for him and his army, but not so much for David's friends that he sent with him. Here we find David's men shamed in verse 4, when Hanun took David's servants and shaved off the one half of their beards and cut off their garments in the middle, even to their buttocks, and sent them away. The whole purpose of this is to literally to shame these men and to cause David embarrassment and shame. This really is far worse than just simply rejecting David's kindness by saying, no thank you. They didn't just say no thanks and then send them back. There was no written verbal message that you will read of at all. In fact, all they did was exactly what you read. You have to understand, in this day and age, these men did not shave, period. Their beards were a source of their pride. So that was part of their pride. And so to cut not only their pride, not just cut their beard off, but one thing, but to cut half of it off is even worse. And then to cut their garments off at the spot where they were exposing their buttocks, would cause even more shame as they returned to the king. In verse 5, we see this, and when they told it unto David, he sent to meet them. In other words, he didn't even make them come into Jerusalem. He knew how shameful this would be for them. And so rather than having to expose themselves to this sort of shame, he said, you tarry at Jericho until your beards be grown, and then return. Now, some of you might be able to grow beards rather rapidly. Me, no way. It's 6 weeks to even get a little bit of hair come out of my face. So that would have meant I had to stay in Jericho for a couple of months, and probably longer than that, maybe even up to 3 months, until their beards began to fill in a little bit more. David knew what the Ammonites did and how ashamed these men were, and so he helped to remove that by going to them rather than making them come to him. Doesn't it show you again how, humble David is? He looks at and he's more concerned for these men than he is for himself. He isn't concerned that, I'm the king, I'm here. No, the king would go to them. Don't ever think that the world is ever going to be kind to you who preach the gospel. Friends cannot be made with the world, and even when you try, they will see a faulty motive, and they will seek to shame you rather than to seek your friendship. It also gives us a little bit of the type of our Savior, in that we should leave everything and any response to our Savior and let him avenge our wrong treatment. In verse 6, we see how the Ammonites now prepare for war. When the children of Ammon saw that they stank before David. Well, that's a good assessment, and that's exactly what happened. They did indeed stink before David. The children of Ammon, though, when they realized what they had done and how, we just stepped on a hornet's nest, says the children of Ammon sent and hired the Syrians of Beth Rehob and the Syrians of Zoba, 20,000 footmen, and a king of Maacah, 1,000 men, and of Ishtab, 12,000 men. You're talking about at least they hired out and gathered together 33,000 armed men. First Chronicles has a slightly different number, talking about the 32,000 chariots and horsemen. But once David hears of their plans, the king starts making his plans for war. And who does he get? Both Joab and his brother Abishai are active military leaders to fight against this mob of idolaters. And so the battle appears to take place of what is called Rabbah or Medebah. And so we read that, how that David again prepares for war. In verse 7, when David heard it, he sent Joab and all the host of the mighty men. Pay particular attention to this, because in the next chapter you're also going to read David didn't go to war with them. He sent them to war. And in the next chapter you're going to read about where David, instead of going to war at the times of kings, which was usually in the springtime where they had food abundantly to help with the feeding of their armies, David stayed home, and that's when he hooked up with Bathsheba, if you remember that. So, well, let's keep on going. Verse 8, and the children of Ammon came out. They were the instigators. They were the ones who started, but David is there, and the children of Ammon came out and put the battle in array at the entering in of the gate, and the Syrians of Zoba and Rehob and Ishtab and Maacah were by themselves in the field. Now, again, this may have been a planned ambush, but it is found out by Joab, and he ends up adapting and dividing his army. Verse 9, Joab makes an observation. When Joab saw that the front of the battle was against him before and behind, he chose all of the choice men of Israel and put them in array against the Assyrians. And the rest of the people, he delivered into the hand of Abishai, his brother, that he might put them in array against the children of Ammon. Now, again, Joab is the military commander, and he adds an alternative plan just in case that plan doesn't fare well. He's going to take a certain amount of men, and he's going to go to the front, and Abishai is going to be the one that's going to go to the rear. And listen what he does. And he said, if the Syrians be too strong for me, you're going to come help me. But if the children of Ammon be too strong for thee, then I will come and help thee. So it gives you also a little bit better picture of the fact that they're not just everybody's lined up in a line and they're all fighting. They're fighting, but they're going at it at different angles, different ways, trying to gain the upper hand. And so there's some sort of signal that's also agreed upon, or the use of messengers that could let them each know how it was going. Joab was a very calculating military commander, and his plan considered the possibility of a partial defeat. But even in that, he was going to figure out how to turn defeat into success. So again, if I'm losing a little bit, then you come help me. If you're losing a little bit, then I will come and help you. Then we read verse 12, which is where my sermon will be on Sunday. Be of good courage, and let us play the men for our people and for the cities of our God. And the Lord do that which seemeth him good. In other words, trust in the Lord. Follow the plan, go full steam ahead, but trust in the Lord. Despite what his men might have seen and could have caused distress and encouragement, Joab has a message of hope and encouragement. He gives them the motive to fight. Be of good courage. Let us play the men. Why? For our people and for the cities of our God. And let's just let the Lord do what seemeth good to him. You see, he's saying, let's go after it. Let's get into the fight, and then we'll leave the results up to God. Well, that's the way we ought to do. they were considering, and Joab was, Jehovah's sovereign purpose. When you see the Lord, the word Lord in all caps, that is the word Jehovah. Just so you know, again, that's what that is. So what happens? Let's go through this. The Syrians flee, verses 13 through 16. And Joab drew nigh, and the people that were with him unto the battle against the Syrians, and they fled before him. And what do we read? The Ammonites flee. And when the children of Ammon saw that the Syrians fled, they were like, uh-oh. Then they fled also before Abishai and entered into the city. So what are they doing? They're backtracking. They're going back into their city. They're closing the gates. And they're probably expecting a siege. But that's not what happens. Joab returned from the children of Ammon and came to Jerusalem. I don't know if that was a good idea, but nonetheless, that's exactly what happened. And when the Syrians saw that they were smitten before Israel, they gathered themselves together. If you remember, the Syrians were spread into 4 different kind of quadrants or kings that were there. And in this particular time, they regrouped. Since they saw that the Ammonites fled, the Syrians were here, and they saw they were smitten, they kind of regrouped, and they got back together. Verse 16, and Hadarezer, now see, I said this I don't know how many times. Pat, I think, heard me saying it back in my back room, and I was doing just fine. Hadarezer sent and brought out the Syrians that were beyond the river, and they came to Helam, and Shobach, the captain of the host of Hadarezer, went before them. And when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together. Now, if you remember, at one time, Saul was able to gather together at least 300,000 military men that were trained and dedicated, responsible. They did not use chariots and horsemen like the other nations. They were told not to rely, in fact, on horses. But he gathered them all together and passed over Jordan and came to Helam, and the Syrians set themselves in array against David and fought with him. So this is kind of the third and final battle of Hadarezer against Israel. And he will fail, and he will finally become a tributary to the kingdom of David. He had recovered from that great loss against David in chapter 8, or the Ammonites had, but now he will never again be a problem to Israel. Even when he knew the Ammonites were defeated, he gathers these forces, thinking maybe that David's forces are now weakened, and it's an opportunity to attack David once and for all. Basically, again, if you go into 1 Chronicles 19, you're going to read almost identical facts that are there. And then verse 18, but what happens? David's victory. The Syrians fled before Israel, and David slew the men of 700 chariots of the Syrians and 40,000 horsemen, and smote Shobach, the captain of their host, who died there. And then we read, and all the kings, all the kings that were servants to Hadarezer saw that they were smitten before Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them. So the Syrians feared to help the children of Ammon anymore. We're not going there ever again. Joab, Abishai, and their king David were victors. So much so that this ended that long-standing confederacy of the Syrians and the Ammonites. Syria seemed to have the more fierce fighters, but they were no longer going to fight with the Ammonites. It ends here. David, if you remember, originally sought peace with the Ammonites, but that didn't work. I see a spiritual lesson here. The Christian seeks peace oftentimes with the struggle that we have with our flesh. But in fact, the flesh can never and will never accept a peaceful covenant. it will always fight against you. You cannot make peace with your flesh. The New Testament tells us that we are to crucify the flesh. We are to mortify the deeds of the flesh. There's more than a few spiritual lessons that we can find in the Old Testament dealing with the Edomites, the Ammonites, and the many of the other ites that you'll find in here that give us a picture that you and I should never try to make a covenant with our own flesh to find peace. The Christian cannot. In this story, there is a peace made with Israel, but it's a forced peace. It's a peace to keep from being completely wiped out. It happens, though, after the Syrians basically lose 47,000 of their forces. Josephus says that their army could have been as large as 80,000 footmen and 10,000 horsemen. Again, I mentioned to you, David could have gathered as many as 300,000 trained and disciplined fighters. That's a huge military campaign in anybody's book. All of those smaller nations that joined with Syria saw the writing on the wall. They made treaties with Israel, and they became instant taxpayers. They became instant financial supporters of the king of Israel, paying tribute. But why are they doing it? They're doing it to survive. And in the next chapter, you're going to find out the Ammonites are going to be at it again. In fact, it's just a little later, about a year later, that the Ammonites reemerge. But instead of going to fight with David and his army, David makes a tragic and terrible mistake. He, of course, admits later and confesses this great sin, but it'll cost him a great deal. But I'll save that for the next lesson when we learn about how David couldn't sleep, hung around outside up on the rooftop, and got into trouble for a lifetime. Pray that's been a blessing to you, just a little bit more, and an encouragement to you to get in. I just thought it was a good time again to go through the Ammonites. There weren't a lot of scriptures, and gave us a good time to be able to look at them. And I had actually forgotten that the Ammonites and the Moabites were a product of Lot and his incest with his daughters.